Seraphine had always known that standing still was its own kind of power. She stood at the threshold of the great hall of Ironmore, and the hall looked back at her. 7 long tables, 7 pack banners hanging from iron chains in the rafters, hundreds of wolves in their finest clothes, every face turned toward the door where she stood in white. The bond mark on her collarbone was warm. It had been warm for 2 years, ever since the night Kale Dravan had found her in the forest during the autumn hunt, and the world had simply rearranged itself around them both. That was how it worked with mates. The universe made a decision and informed you of it afterward. She walked in. Her footsteps were quiet on the stone floor. She had practiced nothing about this moment, not the walk, not the expression, not the way she held her hands. She had simply gotten dressed and come. That was all the claiming rite required of a mate. Show up, be acknowledged, go home wearing a crown. At the far end of the hall, Kale sat on the throne of Ironmore. He was the kind of man who made rooms feel smaller just by being in them. Not because he took up too much space, but because everything else seemed to recede a little, the way details blur around whatever the eye decides is important. He had dark hair and a jaw like something a sculptor had worked too hard on, and eyes the precise color of the sky 10 minutes before a storm. She had spent 2 years trying not to notice how he looked. She had not been particularly successful. He was not looking at her. She noticed this. She filed it away somewhere quiet and kept walking. The pack leaders watched her from their tables. Alpha Maria of Thornwood, with her silver-streaked hair and the careful eyes of a woman who had survived 17 years of border politics. Old Alpha Doran of Greymount, who smelled like pine resin and kept his opinions behind his teeth until they were worth something. 5 others whose names she knew, whose territories she had studied, whose alliances with Ironmore she understood better than most of Kale's own advisors gave her credit for. They all looked at her collarbone first. Then her face. She watched them do this. She reached the foot of the throne steps and stopped. The room went quiet, in the particular way that rooms do when something important is about to happen, and everyone present already suspects they will be talking about this night for the rest of their lives. Kale stood. He was wearing black, which he always wore, because he had been the Alpha King since he was 23 years old, and he had long since stopped performing for anyone. His expression was the controlled, cool expression she knew from treaty meetings and dawn councils, and the one time she had watched him stand over a map of the Northern Territories for 6 hours without once sitting down. It was not the expression of a man about to name the person he loved before the assembled world. She knew all his expressions. She had made a quiet study of them. This one landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. He spoke. "She is not my mate." His voice carried the length of the hall without effort. It was the voice he used for verdicts. "She is a mistake the bond made. I reject the claim." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of 600 wolves, inhaling at the same moment, and then deciding, collectively, not to exhale yet. Seraphine's hand moved before she could stop it. One press of her fingertips to the bond mark at her collarbone. 1 second, the way you touch something to check if it is still there. It was. It was also, for the first time in 2 years, beginning to go cold. She lowered her hand. She did not cry. She had known, in the place beneath knowing where the body keeps its truest information, that something was wrong for 3 days. She had named it to herself in small, careful words. He will not meet your eyes. He has gone somewhere you cannot reach. Something is coming. She had not let herself name what the something was. Now she knew, and knowing was almost easier than not knowing. She turned around. She walked the length of the hall the same way she had walked in, without hurry, without theater. The pack leaders watched her pass their tables. Alpha Maria's jaw was tight. Old Doran had set down his cup. At the door, she did not look back. Outside, the night was cold and very clear. The stars over Ironmore were the kind of stars that only appear when the air is perfectly dry, sharp and numerous, and indifferent to everything happening beneath them. She walked through the courtyard, through the main gate, and onto the road that led away from the king's seat. She had 30 miles to walk, and no particular destination. She started walking. Alpha Maria of Thornwood left the feast at the 11th hour. She did not excuse herself. She stood up from her table. looked once at the throne where Kale was accepting the careful, performative sympathy of his remaining advisors, and walked out. Her second followed. Her third. The Thornwood table emptied in the time it took the wine servers to make one round. Kale, across the hall, assumed this was deference. Court had always reorganized itself around his decisions. He had been a king long enough that he had stopped examining the difference between agreement and compliance. He did not notice, because he was not looking for it, that no one at his own table refilled his cup after that. By midnight, 3 more pack alphas had sent quiet word to their households. Pack up the formal wear, we ride at first light. By the time the last fire was banked in Ironmore's great hall, 4 of the 7 pack alliances were already loosening at the knot. Well, Seraphine was 30 miles from Ironmore when she heard hoofbeats. She did not stop walking. Whatever was behind her could catch up or not. She had made her peace with that philosophy in the last 2 hours, and she intended to keep it. It was old Doran. He pulled his horse to a walk beside her and said nothing for a long moment, which was very like him. "Where are you going?" he finally asked. "Forward," she said. He considered this. Greymount's border is 4 miles east of here. My pack's eastern lodge is just inside the line. It has a fire and a bed and a door with a lock. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to see if the other person will make it complicated. "Why?" she asked. "Because what happened tonight was wrong." He said it the way you state a direction. North is north, east is east. What happened tonight was wrong. No heat in it, just the plain shape of a fact. And because my pack follows strength, and strength is not always the loudest voice in the room. She walked 4 miles east with him. He did not offer her comfort, which was exactly right. He offered her a fire, and a locked door, and silence, and those 3 things were worth more than any amount of careful words. She sat in front of that fire for a long time. The bond mark at her collarbone was fully cold now. She had expected it to feel like loss. It felt more like the absence of a sound she had grown so used to that she had stopped hearing it, noticed only once it stopped. She drank the tea that Doran's housekeeper brought without being asked. She watched the fire burn low. Outside, without her knowledge, and without her asking, the world was rearranging itself. 4 pack alphas withdrew their formal allegiance from Ironmore over the next 3 days. Not with drama, not with declarations of war, or challenges to Kale's rule. They simply sent letters, precisely worded, that said what they meant without saying more than they meant. "We are reviewing our alliance terms. We require time to reassess the terms of our cooperation with the Crown. Effective immediately, trade agreements are suspended pending further discussion." Kale read the first letter twice, set it down on his desk. The messenger did not wait for a reply, which was, itself, a message. He read the second and third together, since they arrived within the same hour. The fourth came while he was standing at the window of his study, looking north in the direction of a road he knew led eventually, if you walked far enough, to the Greymount border. His advisors came with explanations. The packs were overreacting. The bond rejection was a political decision, a necessary one. The Northern Alliance required him to appear unattached. There were strategic reasons. There were always strategic reasons for everything a king did. His advisors were very good at finding the reasons afterward. He sent them out. He stood alone in the study. The great hall was below, where Seraphine had stood 2 nights ago. He thought about the way Maria had looked at her as she walked out, not with pity. He had assumed it was pity, but he was a man who had been misreading his own court for 3 days, apparently, and so he sat down with the memory and looked at it more carefully until he finally named what he had seen on Maria's face. Recognition. The pack leaders had looked at Seraphine walking out of that hall with her head level and her hand dropped and nothing on her face that asked anything of anyone, and they had recognized something in her that they had been waiting to see for a long time in someone. He pressed his hand flat to his chest, where a bond mark should have settled 2 years ago and never fully had. He had kept himself too closed, too controlled, always one door too far back from the life he was actually living. The place where her claim should have been was simply quiet, not painful, just gone. He had not known a quiet could feel that loud. Seraphine did not campaign. This was the thing that people, later, would find most difficult to explain about those 9 days. She made no speeches. She sent no letters. She asked nothing of anyone, and promised nothing to anyone. She sat at the eastern lodge of Greymount, and she received whoever came. They came one at a time, the pack alphas, over those 9 days, because they were wolves, and wolves understand instinctively where the true center of gravity is, when the official one has proven unreliable. They rode 4 miles east off the King's Road, and knocked on a door and were let in, and inside they found a woman sitting beside a fire with a pot of tea, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have survived something and have not wasted the experience. She listened to them. That was all. They had things they had been waiting to say to someone for a long time, about the alliances, about the pressures of the Northern Territories, about the way the Crown had been making decisions for the past several years that treated their packs as instruments rather than as people. She listened without advising, without directing, without once suggesting that they do anything at all. By the 9th day, 6 of the 7 packs had people sitting in the lodge in the evenings. Maria came on the 7th day and stayed for 2, sleeping in the east room and riding the border in the mornings, and coming back to the fire at night without explanation. On the 10th day, a rider arrived from Ironmore. Not soldiers, just a rider, alone, bearing no letter. He said only, "He is coming himself. He asks that you receive him." Seraphine looked at the rider for a long moment. "He may come," she said. Cale rode to Greymount alone. He had considered bringing an escort, a formal retinue, some arrangement that would make his arrival look like a king arriving, rather than a man traveling 35 miles to stand in front of a woman he had wronged in front of 600 witnesses. He rejected this idea before he had finished forming it. He had done enough using the crown as a way to avoid the actual substance of a moment. He rode alone, through the cold, and arrived at the eastern lodge as the sun was dropping below the tree line. The door was opened by Doran himself, which told Cale more than a letter could have. The room inside was firelit and simple. A long table, wooden chairs, the kind of furniture that had been chosen for use rather than impression. Around the table sat 6 pack alphas, Maria, Doran, 4 others. They looked at him with the patient, assessing look of people who had already made a decision and were waiting to learn if he understood what it was. Seraphine was not in the room. He understood, immediately and completely, that this was the point. He stood before them without the throne, without the hall, without any of the architecture of power that had always, until this week, done so much of his work for him. He was simply a man standing in a room where he was not the most important person present, which was a thing he had not experienced in nearly a decade. Maria looked at him with her careful eyes. She did not raise her voice. She asked him one word. Why? He could have given her the political answer. He had a political answer. It was ready. It was polished. It explained the Northern Alliance and the strategic necessity and the difficult math of ruling 7 packs in an era of increasingly complex territorial pressure. He did not give her the political answer. He told her the truth. It came out in plain words because he was tired, and because there was no throne to sit on, and because the bond mark on his chest had been silent for 10 days, and the silence had a weight he had not been prepared for. He told her that he was afraid of needing someone completely. That power had been manageable, precisely because he had stayed behind the last door. That on the night of the Claiming Rite, he had looked at Seraphine standing at the threshold in white, with the bond mark warm at her throat, and understood that she was the one thing in his life he could not control, and so he had done the one thing that had always worked before. He had pushed her out first. It sounded smaller than he expected. Most true things did, when you finally said them out loud. The room was very quiet after, and then Seraphine was in the doorway. She had heard everything. The walls were stone, and he had not been quiet. She stood at the threshold, the same position she had occupied in the great hall of Ironmore, in the same stillness, and she looked at him across the room the way you look at something you believed was lost, before you let yourself decide whether it can still be anything at all. She did not cross the room. She did not speak. The bond mark at her collarbone, the one she had pressed once and then let go cold, pulsed, once. A single beat of warmth, there and then uncertain again, the way a light flickers when the power is returning but has not yet decided to stay. He looked at her. She looked back. The door between them was open, It would not close on its own. That was the thing about open doors. Someone had to choose to walk through them, and that someone, this time, was not going to be her.